So I'd like to begin today by talking a little bit about how I became involved with the Let Me Learn process. I worked for the DuPont company. I'm a chemist by training. And I had worked for DuPont it was a large chemical corporation, some of you may have heard of, for 20 years. And by that time, I had grown to be on the committee that decided where educational contributions from DuPont went. And I had also, at the same time, been given responsibility for a manufacturing plant in Rochester, New York. And at that time, that manufacturing plant supported two businesses, but one of the businesses had just been sold to the AGFA company, and we were going to continue to support that business for 1 year. And then that manufacturing was going to leave DuPont, and the plant that I had was going to reduce in size by 50%, and we had a union. So 50% of the people that were in the plant were then going to change jobs. The business that was going to stay in the plant was a small business in DuPont, size-wise, but at the time was the highest ROI business in all of DuPont, and it was a quality critical and delivery critical product. So I was faced with this situation. I was going up to manage this plant. I knew I was going to be losing half my workforce. I knew the other half of my workforce was going to be changing jobs, half of that changing jobs, and I was trying to figure out how the heck am I going to do this and hit all the delivery targets and hit all the quality milestones, et cetera. I came down to Wilmington and to a meeting of the Educational Contribution Committee, and Chris was there giving a presentation about Let Me Learn. She was looking for support from DuPont, and I sat there and listened and said, aha, I think this is pretty applicable to industry. So she left the room and we all had a chat, and I said, guys, I think this is really good stuff, and I think we should give her the money, but I think we should make a condition of that she come do a project with DuPont, and furthermore, I know just the project we want her to do. She should come work with my plant and help us through this transition. And so Chris and Bob Camp started coming up to our plant. We took everybody in the plant, those people who were staying and those people who were leaving, through the inventory. And then we started planning the transition using Let Me Learn as a process. And what we did was we managed to go through that in one whole 1 year period. We transitioned out of the other business. We never had a quality problem. We never missed a delivery. And at the end of that year, I was convinced that Let Me Learn had a place in the business world. And then I began working with it in DuPont. So I had a very practical introduction to Let Me Learn. And I'm here to tell you, I'm an example that this really can work in a business environment. What I'm going to talk about today is, all right, let's try it this way. What I'm going to talk about today is a subject about transformational leadership and how that's important for the success of business today, and how Let Me Learn can help you become a transformational leader. In 1998, Kostas, I'm going to probably say this wrong, Dervitosis, would that be correct? Who is a leading professor at a university in Greece, and he studies operational management. He made this quote. This is in 1998, that businesses are under severe pressure to proceed with organizational transformations in order to cope with the increasing rate of change, environmental change. And that's something that every business in the world right now faces. But a little closer to home with us, Bill Gates, who, as you know, was the CEO and founder of Microsoft and is now the chairman of the Bill Gates Foundation. He understood that in the technology-driven businesses, many times, by the time you figure out you've got a problem, the technology is by you and you're going to fail. And so I would make the declaration that if you're really not continuing to learn and move to stay with or ahead of your competition, you're not going to be successful in the global business environment. So in today's session, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about how leadership, transformational leadership in particular, impacts organizational learning. I'm going to talk about and present a framework to think about transformational leadership. And then I'm going to make the case for Let Me Learn and how the Let Me Learn process, if you take it into your business or your organization, can help transform your personal leadership and transform the performance of your organization. Today's businesses face a lot of problems, and there's a lot been written about it. We have a lot of complexity in businesses today. We have a global business environment. There's a lot of government regulation, and a lot of that regulation is changing fairly quickly. We have information overload. Anybody, I mean, all of you, I see many of you carrying a personal device of some sort that is bombarding you with information all the time. The technology is accelerating. I don't know, it doubles every 2 years or some just phenomenal figure. And there's a need to manage all that information in a way that's positive for your organization. And organizations need to adapt to change much faster than they used to back, when manufacturing was sort of the king of the world. In 2004, HR Magazine estimated that just the Fortune 500 businesses lost over $20 billion or $30 billion a year by failing to just manage the information that was available to them. And that was only one of the complex issues that I had on the slide before. If you think about all of those complex issues as something leaders need to manage, think about the amount of money, potential gain or loss that businesses are facing on a day-to-day basis. This morning you heard Chris talk about using learning intentionally so that we could use our learning intentionally. And I'd like to make this statement that I really think that when change is inevitable, as it is in the business environment today, then we need to make learning intentional in our organizations. Because if they don't have the ability to learn, you're not going to stay ahead of your competition. I also believe that the largest untapped potential, the largest untapped source of potential in business is organizational and individual, the resource that we have. And I think a lot of that's not tapped because we don't know how to get to it. And it's my belief that Let Me Learn really helps us do that better. So I heard a lot of people in here who had jobs that had to do with organizational development or learning or training, et cetera. So you probably all are familiar with the idea of a learning organization. But we also know that business today is all about performance. It's about performance and results. So if you create a learning organization that's not generating business results, it's not going to be a success. Organizational learning, however, is very important to your success. So both individuals and organizations need to be brought along this learning path. So that's my assumption. And I think that the organization that learns quickest is the one that's going to stay ahead of the competition, because the state of learning in the world and the rate at which things are changing is accelerating. So they're going on a path like that. And if we're going to stay with them, we have to get up. Organizational learning can help you in a couple of ways. It can help you tap your human potential, and it can also help you solve the problems that are facing you on a day-to-day basis. So Peter Senge, who has probably created the seminal work on the learning organizations, had this to say. He really believes that learning is key to everything that we do. And you probably can read this because it's big and black, but he talks about the fact that through learning we recreate ourselves. Through learning we become able to do something we were never able to do before. Through learning, we re-perceive the world and our relationship to the world. And through learning, we extend our capacity to create and to be a part of the generative process of life. So if we're not creating something in our businesses, then what value really are we bringing to the world? But creating a learning organization is not easy. It's been well studied, and we understand the characteristics of a learning organization. So in learning organizations, everybody learns. And everybody understands the importance of learning to the success of their organization. Learning is strategic, it's planned, it's integrated, and it's running parallel to the business processes in a learning organization. We know that there's a great focus on creativity and a recognition that risk-taking is important in a learning organization. And there are systems in place that keep people from being punished when risk-taking fails. And we also know that learning organizations focus on systems thinking. We even have studied the steps needed to create a learning organization. And again, they're easy to document, they're not so easy to do. I've listed them up here. The first step in trying to create a learning organization is you really have to assess the organizational culture. And we're going to talk about that in one of the breakouts this afternoon. But the role of leadership in creating an organization that's a learning organization is completely paramount. Leadership really is the key. This is not a bottoms-up process. Creating a learning organization is a top-down effort. So learning organizations don't just happen. Really, they are created. And I think it's important that the type of leadership that's in an organization that wants to become a learning organization, there is a particular type of leadership that you need to bring in to a learning organization generation. And I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about the difference briefly between transactional leadership and transformative leadership, or transformational leadership. And then we're going to go on and look in a little more detail at transformational leadership. In 1998, James McGregor Burns published a work where it was a book on leadership. And in that, he identified two types of leadership that have been widely discussed. One is transactional leadership, and the other is transforming or transformational leadership. Burns was a scholar. He was a biographer of presidents, and he was a leading authority on leadership. He had studied it extensively. And he identified transactional leadership as sort of managerial leadership. That's the kind of leadership we have where we motivate an organization through a system of reward, and I'll call punishment not the right word, but reward and consequences. So we cause the organization to do what we want them to do through transactional methods. And it's necessary for that all organizations have some transactional leadership in place. It's not, these aren't good or bad, they're kind of different from one another. But he also then identified another kind of leadership, which he called transforming leadership. And in transforming leadership, the leader gets an organization to move forward in a way where they are actually working toward some sort of a higher goal. And they're reaching sort of higher levels than they were before. And studies have shown that if you're trying to generate a learning organization or drive learning in your organization, you need to have transforming leadership present as well as transactional leadership. Both are important to produce business results. So I'm not saying that one is more important than the other. They're both necessary. But what we're going to talk about today is transforming leadership, which is because that is the one that's going to create the potential for learning in your organization. So transforming leadership is a style of leadership where first and foremost a vision is created because the leader has seen some sort of a change that's necessary, and he creates a vision and holds it up to the organization that causes them to be motivated to move outside themselves towards some greater good. And the organization then commits itself to achieving that goal, and they tend to do things that they didn't think were possible. Now, I'm highly precise. I have a 34 in precision. I'm going to read you something here. I took some notes. That's what we precise people do. Oops, wrong set of notes. And I want to read this because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. So transformational leadership is a style of leadership where the leadership is charged with identifying a needed change, creating a vision to guide that change through inspiration, and committing members of the group to that vision. It serves to enhance motivation, enhance morale, enhance job performance through a variety of mechanisms. And these mechanisms include the follower's sense of identity and self to the project and the collective identity toward the organization. So they're very connected to the project and also connected to the organization. He also serves as a role model for followers in order to inspire them and to raise interest in the project, challenging followers to take ownership for their work and understand the strengths he understands the strengths and weaknesses of his followers, allowing him to align them with tasks that enhance their performance. And then there's a whole list of other things that he does. But one thing is that they really create a system of shared values and beliefs within the organization that people can aspire to. So there are certain characteristics that we see in transforming or transformational leaders. One is that they clearly articulate a vision and goals that people are going after. And you can think about somebody in the United States like John F. Kennedy, who when he came into his presidency, the United States was in a space race with Russia, and quite frankly, we weren't winning it. we had had rocket launches where rockets had fallen over on the pads, where rockets had gone up and blown up in the air. And Kennedy came into office and said, by the end of the decade, this is the 1960s, we're going to put a man on the moon. And that vision then was picked up by the leadership of NASA, the space organization in the United States. And they were able to articulate a series of sort of missions through the Mercury missions, the one-man missions, the Gemini, the two-man missions, and finally the Apollo missions, and put a man on the moon in less than 9 years. And it was an incredible achievement that was driven because both Kennedy and then the leadership of NASA behind him were able to lift that up and lift the organization up to that vision. Shared values, shared vision, and a great achievement. Secondly, the transformational leader is one who's able to define things that others can do. So they're not just out there throwing some world peace vision, which is a nice thing, and I'd love to have that, but they're actually creating a vision that's achievable in our lifetime. That's something, everybody can agree that world peace is a great thing, but most of us really can't see how to make that happen. Transformational leaders pick up a vision of something they can see is possible. It's a reach, it's a stretch, but it is possible. And people can kind of get on board with that. Transformational leaders are good delegators. They work well with their organization. They don't have to do everything themselves. Transformational leaders encourage others to be bold. They encourage potential. They affirm and celebrate competence. And they help people who are not showing competence try to achieve competence. And finally, they respect the individual. So we're going to hold those characteristics in mind, and they also model what they preach. But before I'm going to present a framework that I think is going to be very helpful to you. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's leading the thinking of business leaders in the world today. If you think of most business leaders, of particularly corporations that are publicly owned, they're being driven by their shareholders, sometimes on a quarter-by-quarter basis, to show results. And if they don't achieve those results, they're out and somebody else is in there. So the things that are really driving the thinking in our business community today are these things: the economics of their business, the legality of what they're doing. And they're thinking about, is this legal? Not necessarily is it right or good, just is it legal? They're thinking about rights, but from the perspective of entitlement. What are the rights of the workers? What are the rights of managers? What are the rights of the owners? What are the rights of the country that we're in, the company that we have? And most of them have a very problem-solving mindset. If you remember that list of complex issues that I put down there, we're looking at solving problems. We're not necessarily looking at potential. So the question is, that I would put out, is that if we're really going to be able to approach some of those problems and we're really going to be able to achieve things, what's the mindset we need to come from? It's my belief also that the perspective that you hold drives your mindset. So it drives where you're going. It drives what you're attracted to. It drives what you are repelled from. And it will, in essence, create what you achieve. And we all have a philosophy that we're operating from, and those of us who are leaders in organizations probably have some philosophy that we're working from in leadership. But we need something that will allow us to structure our mind in a way that we can look at our leadership from a different perspective. And so I think what I'd like to do now, I'm going to talk about a framework that you'll be able to use to structure your thinking around transformational leadership. And I use the word framework very purposefully here. I'm not putting up a model. So a model is something we imitate, but a framework is a structure we build around. And what I want to do is give you an idea that you can structure your thinking around. I'm not trying to create a model that you can follow. And I will use some examples, but again, if you're going to be a leader, you need to structure your leadership around, first, your uniqueness that you're trying to bring to the workplace, and then some specific aspects if you really want to become a leader that can create learning in your organization. Okay, so this is a framework for transformational leadership. And this framework has two sets of elements. One set, which is the set that's going to create motivation in your organization, and a second set that's going to be able to create the operational changes that that your organization needs to undertake if they're going to achieve the vision that you're going to lay out for them. The elements that are going to allow you to create motivation, the framework elements, are authenticity and vision, with authenticity being the ground that your leadership is built on, and vision being the goal that you're trying to create with your organization. The elements that are going to allow you to operationalize that are ideals and change, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. Okay? So let's talk first about authenticity. Authenticity really is the key for transformational leadership, because if you're going to get a bunch of people in a boat with you headed out to sea towards some goal, they need to trust you. They need to understand that where you're coming from is not phony, that you really actually believe you're coming from a set of values that they can join to, and that you really believe in what you're doing. And we can talk, I put two definitions down here for authenticity: the quality or condition of being authentic, genuine, or trustworthy. Trust me, and you know this too, people know when you're not being genuine. If you're trying to model somebody else's leadership, you're trying to be a Bill Gates, you're trying to be a John Kennedy, and it's not what is your essential nature, folks are going to know that. And people they don't follow people they don't think are authentic. They may do what you ask them to do in a transactional process, but they're not going to get outside of themselves to something greater if you're not authentic. In philosophy, authenticity is really the degree to which somebody is true to their own philosophy, spirit, or character. So I will also say that businesses need to be authentic, that businesses need to be delivering something of value for people to really get on the business's bandwagon. And we saw a good example of how that doesn't work when the mortgage markets collapsed in 2009, 8, 9, and 10. Because those mortgage securities were created around something that was adding no value to anyone. It was just sort of it was just sort of creation of wealth on paper. And you saw that when that fell apart, what happened to the global economy. So we really need to make sure that the businesses that we're creating, the entrepreneurs that we're supporting, actually have products that are generating some value into the environment. The goal of authentic leadership, of transformational leadership, is to create a vision that people can take a hold of and move with. So they need to be able to outline, create a picture of the valued outcomes that we're looking for. And that's what allows an organizational member to take a hold of it and start to go beyond themselves. Another example of someone who had a great vision, and you saw, you saw the company come up and then go down and then come back up, with Steve Jobs with Apple. So Steve had a vision of of these things called personal computers that none of us had even thought about. And he was able to build this company from scratch into a world power. And as he did that, and this quite often happens with entrepreneurial businesses, they sort of outgrow their processes, et cetera. And the leadership of the board of Apple eventually threw Steve out. And they felt he was not important to their company. And you saw then Apple go down. And eventually they asked him to come back. And he came back and re-envisioned, like Senji says, re-envisioned Apple, not as a computer company, but as a company that creates all these devices that we all are so enamored with. And then you saw he holding that vision up to his organization, and the organization coming back up in terms of being able to add value. So you can really see how important a leader is, a real clear vision can be to the success of an organization. The tools for transformation are two things. One is the leader being able to outline for the organization enough the step-by-step changes that need to happen for the organization to go from where they are to where the vision is. You can't just lay a vision out there and expect everybody to get to it. There's got to be some view of how that vision is going to progress. And if we think about the space agency, they started with unmanned space flights, then they went to one-man space flights, two-man space flights, three-man, and they moved in that sort of step by step. In each case, developing technologies that they needed. You know, how do you bring two spaceships together and hook them up? How do you create something that you can land and take off from the moon? All of those things were individual projects that had to be done, but they were able to lay out kind of a path. Well, if we can do it unmanned and we can do it one, we can do it two, we can have two spaceships join up and together, we can then land something, we can then eventually get to the moon. But the other thing that's important is you have to create shared beliefs and values that your organization can hold on to. Because if you don't do that, you'll never get the organization to move beyond the people in your organization to move beyond their individual needs and requirements. I'm going to share with you the list of Apple Computer's values. So they've actually articulated the values that Apple believes that everyone in their organization must own to make that organization successful. And this is what that list is. We believe that we're on the face of the earth to make great products. We believe in the simple, not the complex. We believe that we need to own and control the primary technologies behind the products we make. And I think if you think about the way Steve Jobs ran Apple, that is very apparent in the way they did business. We participate only in markets where we can make significant contributions. We believe in saying no to thousands of projects so that we can really focus on the few that are truly important and meaningful to us. We believe in deep collaboration, which allow us to innovate in a way that others cannot. We don't settle for anything less than excellence in every group in the company, and we have the self-honesty to admit when we're wrong and the courage to change. It's a pretty powerful statement of values that's been articulated for their organization. And Apple, continues to amaze, and it'll be interesting to see what happens now. It's a year and a half since Steve Jobs died. They're still bringing out new things that were maybe on the pipeline. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to Apple with their new leadership and whether they've got somebody that's going to be able to step in and provide the kind of transforming leadership that Steve Jobs provided to them. So I hope at this point, I've at least made my point that to be successful today takes an organization that can learn, and to create an organization to learn, we need a type of leadership called transformational leadership. And I hope I've shown you a model that can structure your thinking around what a transformational leader needs to do. I'm now going to stop, and I'm going to start to focus on why I think Let Me Learn is a process that can help you get there. Are there any questions so far? I know I've talked a lot and fast. No? Okay. So the place where Let Me Learn can really help you has to do with authenticity as a leader. Being authentic is not as easy as it sounds. And creating authenticity in a business is actually not as easy as it sounds. Authenticity really comes from self-knowledge. So it comes from how well we know ourselves and how well we're able to sort of express that out into the environment. A lot of business leaders today model their leadership on people they see being successful. And some of the people that we see being successful are not particularly authentic people. They use transactional leadership processes, which are okay, but they aren't really in touch with who they are in many cases. Some of them are, some of them not. So one of the things that Let Me Learn can do for you is it can really help get you in touch with who you are as a learner. And one of the things that I've experienced is that as I became more in touch with who I was as a learner and was able to kind of live that out in my organization, I became a lot more effective. And I'm going to give you an example. I worked in DuPont for 20 years before I came into Let Me Learn, and I was very successful. But I got a lot of feedback. It didn't usually come directly to me. It sort of came around the corner, that people found me to be intimidating. And I always just passed that off to, I'm big and I've got a deep voice for a woman and I'm kind of pushy and maybe they see me that. But I always thought I was a pretty nice person, so I never could really quite understand where the intimidating thing came from. And I'm very high in precision, and my main process for learning is question asking. And I go at it. People in my organization at Rochester, they referred to me behind my back. They were very into NASCAR. And at the time, there was a driver named Dale Earnhardt, and he was referred to as the Intimidator. My people in Rochester referred to me behind my back, I found out later, as the Interrogator. That when I would come out on the floor, and talk to people, I was just after them. What's this? What are you doing? And as an organizational leader, one of the things I didn't understand is that when I came and asked questions like that to people, they were under the assumption that I thought they were doing something wrong. I was just learning. So I didn't actually pick it up there at Rochester, but finally I had a young woman who worked in the same business that I did. I was the operations manager by that time for the whole inkjet business. So and she managed the semi-works at our R&D lab. And the semi-works was where we took products out of the glass work, put them in small-scale manufacturing, and then moved them to large-scale manufacturing. And I thought highly of this woman. She was really good at what she did. So we actually got her promoted into another job. And she called me on the phone, and she said, Noreen, I just want to tell you how much I appreciated working with you. I learned a lot from you. And but I want to tell you that when I first started working with you, every time your name came up on my phone, because we all are, we were all connected, and every time your name came up on my phone, my stomach went into knots. I was like, what? Really? And I said, Danielle, why? And she said, and she was a use-first technical reasoning engineer learner, right? She said, because you would shoot these rapid-fire questions at me so fast that I'd be still writing down the first question and you were asking the third question. And she said and I was trying to figure out how to answer your first question, and you were on, by this time, to your fifth question. And I went like this, oh. And I said to her, Danielle, I never meant that you should have to answer them right then and there. But because I was hierarchically higher than her in the organization, that was her assumption. Eventually, she worked with me enough to kind of recognize that. But when I found that, it was this huge aha to me. And I thought to myself, I'm not trying to create stress or be intimidating. And I instantly changed the process I was using with my people. So I would do one of two things. If you were working on something that I didn't know what, I wanted to learn about, I'd go in and say, hey, I'm not really very familiar with this, and I'd really like to learn about it. Can you tell me what you're doing? That's a whole different question than, can you tell me what you're doing right now? And if I had questions for people in my organization, I would call them on the phone and say, hey, this is Noreen. I have a few questions for you. Can you take these questions down and get back to me? And if I needed an answer by 5 o'clock at night, I would, I'd say, hey, I really need to know this by 5. Or I'd say, you can get back to me in a couple of days. It took a lot of stress out of the organization that I had been creating unknowingly just because of my learning process. And they're the kind of personal things that you can learn about yourself that make you a much more effective leader with your organization. And they're the kind of things you can learn about the people in your organization that, again, you can help them be much more successful in their job. So I would say a couple of things. This morning, I would think both subgroups probably talked about this. Patterns really influence the way we think about things, the way we feel about things, and the way we do things. And as a leader in the organization, you can positively influence your organization, or you can negatively influence your organization. And sometimes you're negatively influencing your organization without even knowing it. So if you really want to be authentic, and really want to be able to build something of a learning organization, then what you really need is to be able to articulate your thoughts and feelings in a way that's useful to the organization, and you need to be able to walk the talk. And Let Me Learn helps you do that, because it helps you get so much more in touch with who you are as a learner and who you are as a leader, that it helps you be able to shift and modify your behavior in a way that you influence positively in your organization, as opposed to unexpectedly negative in your organization. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me talk about how you internalize the Let Me Learn process. So the process of learning is something that I think of like this. It's a series of sort of nested activities. When you're first trying to learn something, that's sort of a process of acquisition. So we read about it, we hear about it, we go to a conference, we write notes about it, but we don't really have it at that point. It's kind of like learning how to play the piano. You sit down, you learn the scales, you have to think about where you put each finger, so it's not really internalized, and you're not playing really nice music at that point. But if you start to think about it and start to use it, so you're applying it, even just to yourself, and then you gain some experience with it, eventually, you're going to get to a process of integration where you've actually so integrated this in the way you live that it just becomes every part of your everyday operation. And I can give you an example of how this has happened to me. So I retired from DuPont, and I started to do something that I'd always wanted to do, which was, I have a horse. I've had a horse for a long time, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about sort of training horses. So unfortunately, my horse, who I'd had for 23 years, died. He was 32 years old, so it wasn't such a big deal. And I bought a new horse. So my old horse was a really nice horse, and my new horse was a pretty nice horse. But my new horse, when I went to give him a carrot, he would come at me with his ears back. It was like, give me a cookie and no one gets hurt. And I thought, that's no way for a horse to behave. But I couldn't quite figure him out. He wasn't mean. He wasn't trying to bite me. He just was really different than my other horse. So I'm like, okay, I need to obviously learn something. And somebody suggested to me that I learn something about natural horsemanship, horse whispering. And they said, your problem is you're talking to a horse in English and he understands body language. You need to learn body language of the horse. So I started studying this and I started looking at it and I thought, we could really use equine assisted learning and connect it to corporate training, and we could bring people in, teach them about their learning patterns, have them work with the horses, and the next thing you know, we've got teamwork development. And that's what I started to do. So you can really, and I'm telling you, I got some really interesting feedback from the sessions we ran of that. You can really start to use this with your wives, your husbands, your children, your churches. It just becomes a big part of what you do. And it makes you a lot more effective with the people that you're dealing with. Yep, did we lose it? Oh no. All right, well, I'm just gonna go on and talk because we're really running tight on time. The second way Let Me Learn can be helpful to you is that it can help you know your people. If you really start to understand the aspects of the four patterns, then you're going to be able to see those patterns in the way your people work. You're going to see the people who insist on having a plan all the time that must be high in sequence. You're going to see the people who are good at researching. You're going to see the people who want to work alone, and you can start to understand where their uniqueness is as a learner, and it can help you then work better with them as a learner. It also really expresses respect for them. And again, you want to be more authentic? You come at a person from the point of how they learn as opposed to how you learn, and all of a sudden, their sense of your authenticity, this person really understands me, they really respect me, it goes up. So another thing that we know about patterns and about learning is that learning and emotions are tied together. Change in today's environment is really inevitable. And so we know change makes people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. And you have that, sometimes you get that bad feeling. I have a bad feeling about this. Quite often people who have a feeling of discomfort, you give them a task and you can just see they are uncomfortable. Quite often that has to do with the fact that the tasks that you've given them and the way they learn about things, the patterns that they use, are not very well aligned. If you can start to pick that up with people, then you can, again, help them develop strategies on how they need to approach things that they're not familiar with and not comfortable with. It accelerates their learning. And again, it increases your authenticity. Every time that happens and their perception of your authenticity rises, they're much more likely to want to jump in the boat with you and head off towards your vision. Also, we can have conflicts of patterns in the workplace. So people approach things differently, and the example I gave this morning of my operators on the floor and the technical people who were trying to train him is a great example of that. The operators were very sequential. They needed to do things 1, 2, 3. The technical people were highly technical reasoning driven. They just needed to get out there and fix something. And once we were able to get them all to see the patterns they were using, they were able to drop the assumptions that they had made about other people and their approaches. And that quite often is very helpful because it will allow you to get a team functioning a lot better together, and there's a lot less of that snarky stuff behind, that guy's just you never can get him to stay on task, or, this one's always holding us back because we're always waiting for them to do something. That all goes away because people start to recognize what other folks need, and instead of being snippy about it, they actually start to be helpful about it. Hey, I recognize that he needs to do such, so let's do this, and then we can go forward. So I'm almost finished now, but I want to talk about a problem that we have where we have people getting over-dependent on their use-first patterns. Though, if you get over-dependent on your use-first patterns, that creates some predictable things. If you or people in your organization are over-dependent on sequence, you quite often will see a lack of flexibility or a lack of originality, because they've got to have a plan, and once they get with the plan, they got to stay with the plan. If you are over-dependent on precision, you quite often will see a lot of indecision in your organization, people who can't make a decision because they don't have enough information, they will never have enough information. Or you can see this sort of hair splitting that gets into where people will be disagreeing with each other over such minute differences that they're not really important anymore. They've lost the relevance because they're trying to deal with precision at very fine detail. If you get over-dependent on technical reasoning, you can have an organization that doesn't ask for help when they need it, because people who are high in technical reasoning and not high in anything else are going to solve the problem by heavens, no matter what. Just leave me alone, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do it, leave me alone, I'm going to do it. And they might get beyond their deadlines. They might be in a situation where they just can't do it without help, but they're not going to ask for help. So you have to kind of keep an eye on that. And people who get over-dependent on confluence might be great at starting a project and not so good at finishing a project. So they quite often will need help in operationalizing their wonderful ideas. They will have wonderful ideas, but getting them to completion is sometimes an issue. You can also have problems with people who avoid a particular pattern. If you avoid sequence, you quite often see disorganization or a lack of planning involved. People are just kind of doing things. If you have someone who's doing things by the seat of their pants, they're probably in the avoid sequence category. If you have people that avoid precision, you're going to see inaccuracy or a lack of precision in their work. But the other thing that's really important and sometimes overlooked is people who are in avoid precision or low precision sometimes don't even know what questions to ask. They can't quite figure out even what the question is they should be asking to get the answers that they need. If you find people that are over-dependent on or avoid technical reasoning, you will get inadequate problem solving. And quite often, which is a bigger problem, people who don't understand the relevance of what they're being asked to do. And so they may have a series of tasks, and they don't organize them into the most important to the last important. They just go and do them in whatever order. And so understanding relevance becomes important. Yesterday, we had introduced the app to a group of people for doing the inventory. And there was a woman there who's in the group who avoids technical reasoning. And she would not even pick up her iPhone. This isn't finished. It's not, I'm not going to do it. I mean, she didn't. And a couple of people tried to help her. Well, look, I don't want to do it. I don't want to avoid technical reasoning. Sometimes people are not going to get in there. They're not even going to try a problem. And finally, if you avoid confluence, that usually shows up in a lack of risk-taking, and again, will show up sometimes in a lack of originality. People who are not willing to get out there and take a risk. And if you're going to have an entrepreneurial business, like the minister talked about, you need some risk-taking in your organization. Otherwise, you're going to fail. Also, I'm going to just talk about these four things. You can see pattern conflicts expressing themselves in some very predictable ways. Because I'm high in precision and I managed a lot of people who are high in technical reasoning, there was a lot of potential for me to micromanage them. Because I love information and I wanted to know what they were doing. A lot of times I wanted to know what they were doing because I was learning about something, but a lot of times I was just in their way. And if you make your organization feel micromanaged, then you get into this lack of trust issue, when you'll have people say, "Don't you trust me?" And so you really have to be careful if you're high in sequence, high in precision, that you don't lose the trust of your organization by over-planning for them, by over-questioning them, and you end up having to sort of manage your own behavior. The outrunning of your headlights is kind of an interesting one. If you're high in confluence and not very high in sequence and precision, you can have great vision, but no sort of picture in your head of how you might get from here to there. So you can really describe the vision in a very attractive way, but your organization may not be able to see as far in front of you as you can see. You might be able to see 4 steps down the road, And they can only kind of see this far. And if you can't sort of break up your vision into those pieces, well, we'll go here, and then we'll go here, and then we'll go here, and eventually we'll go there. A lot of times you can't create the motivation you need to get them to move at all. And finally, if you have people in your organization who are managing your organization and they're not very high in precision, and they're not providing the organization with enough information, you get management by rumor and innuendo. Your organization is going to make it up because they're going to have a need for information. And so if you're not giving them enough information, they're going to create their own. And it's very damaging. I don't know if you've ever been in an organization where management by rumor and innuendo got going, but it can be very damaging to the forward progress of the organization, and it certainly isn't a way to help people learn. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that if you can internalize the Let Me Learn process, you can increase your personal authenticity, you can demonstrate respect for your organization, you can promote the learning of your organization and therefore be able to pull way more potential out of individuals and out of your organization. You can foster progress, and I can tell you from personal experience, you are going to enhance the bottom line. To just give you just one final story, in all of that year that I was working with Chris and Let Me Learn, in addition to trying to go through this very difficult transition, I had my technical people working on trying to improve the productivity of the plant that was staying, because DuPont was getting ready to build in Singapore a multi-million-dollar plant because the forecast for this business said we were going to grow beyond the capacity of the plant we were in. While we were doing this entire transition, working with my technical organization, we were able to increase the productivity of our plant by 35%. That is, we were able to make 35% more product than we had at the beginning of that period. And as a result of that, DuPont never had to build the plant in Singapore. And that really was a multi-million-dollar contribution to the corporation. So I can tell you from firsthand experience that if you can internalize the Let Me Learn process and bring it into the things that you do and help other people bring it into what they do or the organizations, it is going to positively impact your bottom line. So that's all I have to say, and I know we're running really late. If you have questions, we'll take a couple, and then hopefully I can get around to you afterwards. No questions? All right then, well, thank you very much for listening.